Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Neil and Joe, for organizing this. And I apologize for not attending the other talks. As I said, it's kind of early in the morning here in California. So my talk is on a pragmatic approach to scientific realism. So for a while now, there has been some discontent with the traditional approaches to scientific realism, the scientific realism, anti-realism debates, rather, in philosophy of science. And that is by the traditional approach, I mean, the approach of presenting them as two opposing, overarching views of science and arguing for one or the other. And such an approach has, I think, slowly been losing traction. So interestingly, Van Fraassen and Psillos, on the opposite ends of the spectrum, one being an anti-realist and the other a realist, have kind of advanced similar arguments for why the traditional points of view don't work. So Psillos has said, the very idea of counting empirical success as being in favor of the truth of a scientific theory, the very idea of evidence making a theory probable, or the very idea that a theory is the best explanation of the evidence, and the like, presupposes that theories are already placed within a realist framework. And for the no miracles argument to work at all, it is presupposed that explanation, and in particular, explanation by postulation, matters, and that scientific theories should be assessed and evaluated on explanatory grounds. So essentially, he's saying that it would be a circular argument to try to argue for realism based on no miracles, because that kind of approach of advancing an explanation by postulation itself is first, situated within a realist framework. And similarly, Van Fraassen says traditional empiricism, or naive empiricism as he calls it, takes empiricism to be a doctrine, typically something like experience is the only source of factual information. And simply put, the problem is that such a doctrine is itself metaphysical and not based on experience. So these are some of the sample arguments for why the traditional approach on each side, on either side, don't work. So just a quick sort of outline. I want to talk about pragmatic reasons for adopting a realist position about science, even though purely epistemological reasons may be lacking. I'm going to go through a catalog of what I view as pragmatic realist positions about science, including Pierre Duhem's, Alison Wylie, Arthur Fine, and also Psillos. I think that these approaches to realism can be seen as a stance in Van Fraassen's sense, as a cluster of attitudes, goals, commitments, and beliefs. I think that philosophical stances don't have to be purely epistemological. We can have an epistemic stance toward further pragmatic ends. And I want to argue for a meta stance of pragmatism or pluralism towards stances rather than a stance monism. So there's been a number of alternate positions for realism and anti-realism, and of course the debate itself from pragmatist perspectives. So I'll first focus on some realist positions. And I begin with Alison Wylie. There's this 1986 short, I think relatively little known paper. So she starts by talking about the indispensability argument for realism. And she says, researchers in the advanced sciences are very largely and increasingly preoccupied with esoteric experiments and esoteric searches, the explicit purpose of which is to find out about entities that exist beyond the range of our unaided senses, either as an end in itself or as a means to explaining observable phenomena. Putnam goes so far as to declare on this basis that it is disingenuous, incoherent, and intellectually dishonest to follow the anti-realist in denying what we must believe in practice. It is just necessary to take a methodological stand concerning the existence and accessibility of some such theoretical entities in order to get the research enterprise off the ground. So this seems like a more practical argument for realism than the no miracles argument. But of course, as Wylie points out, the problem is that indispensability does not guarantee truth. We might be suffering from some systematic delusion. Wylie nevertheless goes on to make a pragmatic case for the indispensability argument. She asks, how should philosophers view science, particularly theoretical postulates that are indispensable to the success of theories? Should we go with or against the practitioner's attitude, the scientific practitioner's attitude? Wylie responds to this by first pointing out that what the realism debate has now come down to is a choice between not just theories or sets of beliefs about science, but broader metaphilosophical principles and values about whether to be more charitable or more critical of scientific claims. She sees realism and anti-realism as distinct philosophical research programs. The anti-realist program values strict epistemic asceticism and abstinence from unjustified beliefs, both at the level of science and philosophy of science. This is good insofar as it helps us realize the tenuousness of our epistemic situation. But on the other hand, the realist program values interpreting scientific claims charitably. What can be the rationale behind the realist program if it doesn't want to succumb to epistemological allegations of taking leaps of faith in taking scientific claims to be true? So realism should look beyond epistemology, beyond just matters of truth, belief, and justification. And the rationale for realism can be pragmatic. So in Wylie's words, sorry, that was kind of, I think, summing up what I said. So in Wylie's words, there remain good pragmatic reasons for embracing scientific realism, and with them, the indispensability argument for realism resurfaces. The analysis of research methodology do establish that successful practice presupposes the independent existence of its subject and the approximate truth of received theoretical knowledge about it. Although these presuppositions may conceivably be false and the success of science a happy accident, or worse, an illusion, the fact that they constitute the actual, albeit tentative and evolving foundation of a form of practice that has served us well suggests that they do warrant charitable explication. The argument supporting this is twofold. First, it is worth seeking a philosophical account of scientific inquiry that makes its presuppositions out to be largely true, just as a matter of general methodological principle. And second, this principle of charity, in particular its application to science, is warranted on independent, pragmatic grounds because inquiry that embodies it stands to contribute to the research enterprise itself. So here then is the pragmatic realism that takes the ontological claims of science seriously, not just from within the perspective of scientific practice, but from an external philosophical standpoint as well. The philosopher can say, taking entities indispensable to a successful practice within science as real serves the pragmatic purpose of furthering the scientific research enterprise. And so I, as a philosopher, will also take them to be real. Such an attitude helps the philosopher of science make sense of and comprehend scientific practice. But of course, as Wylie notes, we should be careful in deciding what particular things to take as real: particles, fields, strings, etc. So, and that depends on how successful theory has been, and how successful is successful enough to warrant existential, commitment to these theoretical entities. She asks, and The answer to that, I guess, can only be answered by, it can only be given by the relevant epistemic community itself, the practitioners of science. So I now want to look at Arthur Fine's natural ontological attitude, another pragmatic approach to scientific realism. So briefly, Fine's view is that our attitude toward electrons and quarks and genes should be the same as it is towards tables and chairs. So like Feigl, Fine also thinks that while operating within the scientific framework, if one asks, for instance, what is the theory about electrons really about? One is forced to reply, but electrons, of course, what else? So Fine then argues that even when one gets outside the arena of science, it's good sense to continue adopting the internal position. Fine distances himself from the traditional realist, or if we may call her the epistemological realist. But I contend that this is nevertheless a realist position, maybe a more, a more modest one, a pragmatic realist position. So he says, unlike the realist, however, I would not tout NOA's success at making science fairly intelligible as an argument in its favor vis-a-vis realism or various anti-realisms. Moreover, I am sensitive to the possibility that explanatory efficacy can be achieved without the explanatory hypothesis being true. NOA may well make science seem fairly intelligible and even rational, but NOA could be quite the wrong view of science for all that. If we posit as a constraint on philosophizing about science, that the scientific enterprise should come out in our philosophy as not too unintelligible or irrational, then perhaps we can say that NOA passes a minimal standard for a philosophy of science. So the third view I want to look at is Pierre Duhem's. Duhem is often seen, interpreted as an instrumentalist, but I mean, there's also realist positions attributed to him, and I also view him as a realist, but again, as a pragmatic sort of realist. So I've made this case in detail in another paper, but I'll go over some key points here. So Duhem is widely thought of as an instrumentalist about physical theories, but in my view, as I said, I think he was a pragmatic realist about the classification of empirical laws by physical theory. So as the theory gets more and more refined, it asymptotically approaches what he called the natural classification, which is kind of the ultimate or perfect classification of empirical laws by theory. But this conviction was held on pragmatic grounds. So he says, everything urges the physicists to postulate the following assertion. To the extent that physical theory makes progress, it becomes more and more similar to a natural classification, which is its ideal end. Physical method is powerless to prove this assertion is warranted. But if it were not, the tendency which directs the development of physics would remain incomprehensible. Thus, in order to find the title to establish its legitimacy, physical theory has to demand it of metaphysics. So Duhem acknowledges that such a positive attitude toward the idea of theory approaching a natural classification is on epistemically shaky ground. He repeatedly points out that this view isn't based on evidence per se, but on reasons beyond reason. But since it is indispensable to scientific life, and also, for the philosopher, if she wants to make sense of the historical development of physics, it is pragmatically justified. So I want to point out two commonalities between these various, pragmatic approaches to realism that I've discussed so far. First, they all transcend a purely belief-based view of science. And second, having a realist attitude towards scientific theories, that is adopting realism as a philosophical research program, according to Wylie, has pragmatic benefits. So a philosophy that I think brings together all of these various approaches, similar approaches to scientific realism, is Bas van Fraassen's voluntarist epistemology and his idea of stances, of philosophical stances. So what is a stance? As a first approximation, a stance can be thought of as an interrelated web of values, commitments, emotions, attitudes, aims, strategies, and beliefs. So it isn't just propositional attitudes, although beliefs are part of it. So a stance has been variously interpreted as an epistemic guide, as an epistemic policy, as a framework, among other things. But for my present purposes, those nuanced distinctions shouldn't matter. So Van Fraassen makes the case for an empirical stance. He thinks traditional empiricism, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, he thinks traditional empiricism taken as a set of beliefs about science doesn't work. So I think we can say the same thing about realism. The realism in the accounts that I've discussed very much seem to be Van Fraassenian stances. So the disagreement now between empiricism and metaphysics or realism is no longer one of doctrines, it is of stances. The disagreement between the empiricist and metaphysical stances is one of values, aims, and attitudes. So how then can we adjudicate among stances? So Van Fraassen has two minimal criteria. First, a stance should be rational in the sense of being internally coherent. It shouldn't lead to self-sabotage by its own lights, as he says. Any stance that satisfies this criterion is considered rational. So this is quite a permissive account of rationality. A stance is permissible as long as it is internally coherent. And second, our values decide our choice of stance. Of course, values are relative to the agent, excuse me, and are in this sense not objective or universal. So Van Fraassen advances a voluntarist epistemology, according to which there is an element of choice in adopting epistemological stances, and rationality underdetermines our choice of stance. So while my values guide me to adopt a certain epistemological stance, I cannot rule a contrary stance as irrational as long as it is self-coherent. So this has naturally led to allegations of relativism. If rationality doesn't compel us to adopt a stance, and if we are to be voluntarists about epistemological stances, then we seem to have to conclude that all stances that aren't internally incoherent are equally acceptable, unless we have some uniform or universal meta-level criteria for choice of values or emotions or attitudes, but that would go against the very spirit of voluntarism, right? So this kind of is captured by the word irrational by Jonathan Reed-Survival. Stance empiricism, he says, is epistemically irrational in the sense of being immune to epistemic reason. So what do we do? So Van Fraassen is at pains to argue that while there is relativism here, we don't end up with some kind of a crippling relativism. So he comments, if this is relativism, it is certainly not debilitating relativism. It is only an acknowledgement of the logic of this aspect of the human condition. So Martin Cush reasonably interprets this to mean that this kind of a relativism is not one that doesn't allow a stance holder to judge or argue. So this is reminiscent of Thomas Kuhn's view on theory choice in objectivity, theory, value judgment and theory choice, where Kuhn argues that theory choice, that is scientific theory choice, is a matter of judgment involving individual or personal factors as well as shared criteria. And that judgments, as opposed to mere tastes or preferences, are eminently discussable. But how do we discuss stances? An empiricist could say to a scientific realist, as Van Fraassen does, things like, belief in unobservable entities is supererogatory, or as Nancy Cartwright says, we are creatures bound in a world of sensation, and so on. It is certainly very possible that two people adopting opposing stances have some meta or shared background values or beliefs on the basis of which such discussions could be meaningful and might even, in fact, result in conversion. But importantly, Van Fraassen's point is that even if that doesn't happen for whatever reason, we still don't have to buy into the opposing stance because of this, the second point about our values. So while the rationality criterion may not rule it out for us, our values do. So in fact, Van Fraassen goes further to say, quote, to take a stance is, however, ipso facto, to rule out all competitors as stances for oneself, end quote. And this ruling out apparently is done on the basis of one's values. He says he's not advocating a general principle of tolerance here, but doesn't this just push the relativism back one step? Now it seems to be a relativism of values or commitments, or whatever it is that Van Fraassen takes to be prior to stances. So Anjan Chakravartty has argued that a relativism of values and hence stances is unavoidable. He claims that philosophy, unlike science, isn't a consensus demanding discipline by nature, at least not to the extent of science. And while there has been progress in the sense of moving from one well-accepted view to another within stances, there has relatively been little progress towards some kind of stance convergence. And, as an example, of course, the realism, anti-realism, or metaphysics, empiricism debates are probably still well and alive. So in agreement with Van Fraassen, Chakravartty argues that stance choice is also not amenable to be studied by a natural or social science, which I think Van Fraassen refers to as an objectifying epistemology. So Chakravartty says the will is utterly impervious to theoretical analysis. And he says, yet we simply cannot do without it here. He then argues that our stances are so deeply connected to our background values and commitments that if pushed to justify a choice of stance or why we do things the way we do, ultimately we'll just have to say, this is simply what I do. So Chakravartty's response is to embrace the relativism. But to be clear, his choice of stance is still the metaphysical or ontological one, one that is continuous with science. But that stems from his values and commitments. And as I understand it, he has no reasons on epistemic or rational grounds to criticize other stances. But per his values, his choice of stance is the ontological or the metaphysical one. So notice that regardless of whether we're talking about an empirical stance by Van Fraassen or an ontological stance by Chakravartty, there are more such positions, but here I'm just talking about these two as representative positions. Both focus on pure epistemology. All the debate at the end of the day is about epistemological stances. And although the epistemological enterprise is itself kind of seen as pragmatic, it's worth noting that other pragmatic goals haven't been of interest. Also, both of these authors are implicitly monistic about their own stance choice. So we've seen that although it might seem that voluntarism paves way for a full-blown relativism and hence pluralism of stances, Van Fraassen doesn't really take this route, as we just saw. At the end of the day, he sticks to his guns and remains an empiricist. And I believe the same can be said about Chakravartty's metaphysical stance. And I should note that Van Fraassen and presumably Chakravartty do allow for the possibility of stance conversion, as I briefly mentioned, propelled by change of emotion, among other things. And so in this sense, they may be interpreted as a minimal pluralist, if we want to call fallibilists as pluralists. But it's not really a pluralistic position in a more robust sense. So Van Fraassen says, quote, engaging in philosophy and engaging in the practice that we are philosophizing about are not at all the same, end quote. He then goes on to distinguish between an empirical stance and an empiricist stance. While the former, that is an empirical stance, refers to the stance of a practicing empirical scientist, the latter, that is the empiricist stance, refers to a philosophical stance regarding science. He notes that while scientists routinely work within an empirical stance in the sense of an epistemic policy, he even cites some scientific papers using the phrase empirical stance while having really nothing to do with any philosophical view of science, he says. An empiricist philosophical position, on the other hand, is a lot more than just an empirical epistemic policy. And he actually notes here in a footnote that, in hindsight, the title of his book should probably have been The Empiricist Stance and not The Empirical Stance. So I take it that Van Fraassen brings up this distinction between philosophical and non-philosophical policies or positions to drive home the point that people in various walks of life might have certain unreflective epistemic policies that don't qualify as philosophical stances, as opposed to other ordinary ones. Well, that's fair enough. However, he seems to implicitly equate, in this context, philosophy to epistemology for its own sake, and a philosophical stance to a purely epistemological one. He says, quote, while an empiricist philosopher will have a characteristic epistemological stance that is not at all the same as having an epistemic stance, the most concise way to indicate the empiricist tradition's tendencies in epistemology is once again to point to the sorts of metaphysics it rejects, end quote. Of course, there are non-epistemological stances like moral stances immediately come to mind, but that's not the kind of distinction I'm drawing here. I'm talking about epistemic stances in the sense Van Fraassen uses the term, and epistemological stances adopted for goals that are ultimately not purely epistemological. Can these be philosophical stances as well? So in response to the question, what is the point of reflection and philosophy? Simon Blackburn identifies a high ground, middle ground, and a low ground response. So the high ground response is that reflection is good for its own sake, even if it is far removed from everyday practice. The middle ground response is that reflection is continuous with practice and influences it. And the low ground response is just a stronger version of the middle ground response. Reflection is sometimes so intimately bound up with everyday practice. So in philosophy of science, I roughly think of philosophers of science in practice and socially engaged philosophers as working more in the middle and maybe low grounds, and various practitioners like scientists, science policymakers, science teachers are more in the, definitely more in the low ground. And of course, epistemologists of science are up in the high ground. So I think philosophy isn't a natural kind, and it's a mistake to equate philosophical stance to an epistemology for its own sake kind of stance. So I invite philosophers to adopt a meta stance of pragmatism and pluralism toward philosophical or epistemological goals and stances. Now, we can talk about a pluralism within the high ground itself, that is within the epistemology of science. For instance, embracing both empiricist and realist stances, but for different philosophical goals. And the three pragmatic realist stances that I discussed earlier, that's Wylie, Fine, and Duhem, or at least just Fine and Wylie, if not Duhem, seem to fall within this high ground insofar as they serve purely philosophical cognitive goals. And Psillos has also advanced a pragmatic approach to scientific realism. Similar to Van Fraassen, he sees realism not as a doctrine, but as a framework. I mean, similar to how Van Fraassen sees empiricism. And Psillos also notes that we have a choice in adopting this framework. He argues that relative to certain aims, the framework is indispensable. But what are those aims? He says it's achieving causal and nomological coherence in our image of the world and for offering cogent explanations of the behavior of gross objects, end quote. But if you have other goals, you're free to not choose the realist framework and perhaps choose the empiricist framework. I'm not sure that Van Fraassen frames his view on the empiricist stance in this way per se. He does not articulate any goals that an empiricist stance is good for. In fact, I think many scholars have noted that he doesn't really give a reason for why we're better off adopting an empiricist stance. All he does is kind of, I think, express a distaste for a metaphysical stance. But anyway, my goal here is to focus a little more on the middle and low grounds of reflection and philosophy of science with some examples. So for a science practitioner, as I discussed earlier, as Duhem argued, a realist position is pragmatically beneficial, for instance, according to Duhem, for a physical theorist, because it motivates the pursuit of physical theory. Believing or accepting, whatever word it is that we want to use, that physical theory is approaching a natural classification motivated the pursuit of physical theory for Duhem. Curtis Forbes also discusses a similar kind of approach, and this is even more of a pragmatic stance, a pragmatic position approach to realism. So he talks about late 19th century history of electrodynamics, and he talks about how in some specific circumstances, for instance, when making refined measurements of natural constants or property magnitudes and theoretical parameters, adopting a metaphysical stance supports progressive scientific practice more readily than an opposing stance, let's say an empiricist stance. And at the same time, something similar can be said for its empiricist rival in other circumstances. So for example, when attempting to produce and explore novel phenomena in the laboratory, as well as for under-considered instrumentalist rival in yet other circumstances, like when constructing powerful unified theories. So essentially, we're talking about adopting different stances toward different ends or goals. But there seems to be some kind of subjectivity and hence relativism, since these goals we've seen so far seem to be purely epistemological. And epistemological voluntarism inherently comes with subjectivity and relativism. This actually applies more to the high ground within the epistemology of science than to the stance adopted by scientific practitioners. Let's consider a science or medical advisor holding a position in government. There's a vaccine hesitancy crisis. Now, this is a situation where an empirical stance is going to make the most sense for the goal of getting more people to be vaccinated. It seems that focusing on unobservable reactions and mechanisms the vaccine sets off in the body is not going to be as productive. Instead, it would be more productive to focus on the it works and it's safe part of things. Of course, I'm simplifying the scenario here. As Maya Goldenberg has persuasively argued, vaccine hesitancy is rooted more in a lack of trust in science than a lack of knowledge. So first, advisors and policymakers would have to engage in trust building. But I think it is safe to say that an empirical stance will play a big part here. Not just the part about focusing on experience and observation, but also the more general respect and admiration for science that is key to the empiricist stance. And in this regard, there's a recent quote by the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who said, quote, "The hots are getting hotter, the dries are getting drier. There's a new reality. You don't believe in climate change, you don't believe in science, you believe your own damn eyes," end quote. So this kind of an empirical stance makes sense in this kind of this pragmatic goal of, when it comes to policy making and, when it comes to science communication with the public and so on, in certain matters. So we're talking about taking an epistemic stance, but for an ultimately pragmatic aim. So insofar as this is based on reflection and sound arguments, I don't see why this shouldn't be seen as a philosophical stance. Van Fraassen seems to want to delimit philosophy of science to looking at the content of science and drawing philosophical conclusions. But as the burgeoning philosophy of science and practice and values in science literature shows us, it is no less philosophical to take practice, be it purely scientific or science policy or education, as the object of philosophizing, and take the stances of those practitioners at face value. Consider another role or context, that of a science teacher. While I think science education should mirror scientific practice to the extent possible and convey the message that science has multiple aims, operates in multiple contexts, and so on, I think a realist stance would make the most sense in a number of educational contexts, even when teaching so-called false theories or falsified theories or empirically inadequate theories, or whatever adjective it is that we want to use. By realist stance, I don't mean a stance that involves, by realist stance, I don't mean a stance that involves the claim that science solely or primarily aims at truth. Rather, what I mean is taking a positive epistemic attitude toward the objects of theories under study. So if the pedagogical goal is mastery of a theory, then a realist attitude on the part of the teacher would be more suitable in order to not lead students to develop some kind of cognitive dissonance. And moreover, if science education is to mirror scientific practice, it makes sense to create a classroom environment when discussing, let's say, Newtonian mechanics, where everyone behaves like what it says is literally true. Of course, the teacher can and arguably should reveal that the theory is false when the time is right, and taking care of age appropriateness and context and all of that. But this claim or proposition is compatible with having an overall realist stance, because remember Van Fraassen's lesson that a stance does not reduce to just a single claim. So a science teacher can have a stance and a philosophical stance toward her teaching. It's more than a policy, and it involves aims and commitments and so on. And it can be adopted on the basis of reflection. So I think such a stance can also be of philosophical interest and can be counted as a philosophical stance. So what if we're pluralists rather than monists about stances? Pluralist, not in the sense of, you have your stance and I have mine, but in the more robust sense of multiple stances make complete sense to me in different contexts with respect to different aims. And I myself would adopt and embrace your stance if I were in your position or your context. So I want to urge Hasok Chang's idea of active normative epistemic pluralism. So this was advanced in the context of scientific theories. So the idea is you actively embrace pluralism. You use different, even mutually incompatible scientific theories for different purposes. That's kind of Chang's idea of what he calls active normative epistemic pluralism. I wonder if we can adopt such an attitude with meta philosophical stances as well. So I think if we do that, the relativism is not as stark, I think. Since we're talking about stances suited to specific goals, and about this we can have rational conversations. We can have rational debates and conversations about what stance is more suitable to a specific epistemic goal or a pragmatic goal. So what I'm trying to advance here is having an attitude toward epistemology as a means to an end. So looking at epistemology in the service of further pragmatic aims. So epistemology for the sake of epistemology is also a legitimate aim, but it's not the only aim. And when it comes to stances on science within philosophy of science, a purely epistemological attitude towards science is not, I think, the only worthy or valid philosophical goal that a philosopher of science can have. So for instance, we can have an epistemology for science policy or an epistemology for science education. And so I think the meta stance that seems to make more sense to me is a pluralistic / pragmatist stance towards stances rather than a monism about stances, even if it is at the individual level. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sindhuja. If we